I'm Alana,
And I'm Jessie.
and we are making mentions. Welcome to the second episode of our little mini series on gossip and Judaism. This part is definitely the more Judaism focused episode. Really excited to have our guest from the first episode, Abby Allen, back with us today. Hi, Abby. And today we'll be more focused on Judaism and gossip, whereas last episode was more focused on gossip as a cultural tool and the ways that it can be used to enact change and can be really subversive. I want to highlight that we did talk about yentas and the definition of yenta last episode. So if you're feeling like that's missing, it's because it's there. So feel free to go back to last week's episode to hear more about that. And who's to say, maybe it'll make an appearance again today. So yeah, let's jump in. I feel like the main thing that everyone talks about when we talk about Judaism and gossip is L'shon Hara. And so I feel like we should just give some space for that and how we interpret that, even though we have sort of talked about that in a previous episode, like kind of a long time ago. Make sure everyone's on the same page. I'm just going to read the general definition of what L'shon Hara is, because I didn't know what it was before learning about it for making mentions purposes. Basically, it's a term of speech about a person or multiple people that is negative or harmful to them, even if it is true. So it's like speech that quote unquote damages the person that's being talked about, either emotionally, financially, or like lowers them in other people's view of them. So basically, like, the idea of L'shon Hara is, I think, how most people conceptualize gossip, like this negative talk that, while it can be true, isn't good for the person who's being talked about.
I think all of that is true. I just think that it's conflated. I don't know. It just is used everywhere in the Jewish world. And that's just the word that we use. It's like, don't do L'shon Hara. It's like, I feel like it was the first thing that I learned as a small child in the Jewish world. Just like the way that it's now colloquial rather than biblical.
I've only heard it used to tell people not to bully other people, almost for that almost middle school age cyberbullying, or, trying to stop preteens from gossiping about other people. It was, these are the Jewish values that say why it's harmful. And it was always L'shon Hara. But I wasn't until I was an adult that I actually looked into why that came from anything and where that Jewish value is rooted in, because it's not obvious. It's not in a bunch of Torah stories, or it's not like B'Tselem Elohim, which is referenced again and again in Hebrew school. Personally, I think it's more obscure.
Yeah, there are like 4 different types of three. I don't know. Someone can maybe correct me about what the different types of gossip are, but there are types of gossip. Jewish, like speaking about people, and L'shon Hara is the only one that I grew up hearing about, which is, I think, the most intense one. So I don't know why that is.
There's Enrekilut, Motzi Shemra's talk that's damaging and false, and Rekilut is tale-bearing. But those are the 3 I know of. We can talk more about that, sorry, when we get to my portion of the document that I'm skipping ahead to.
I feel like let's jump there.
Okay, this part that I'm pulling this from is from this fantastic essay article by Rabbi Mark Dratch, and we referenced this when we talked about the Chaim Walder episode, that we kind of like unpacked all of what was going on then. But it's called Let Them Talk, the Mitzvah to Speak L'shon Hara, and it's reframing the idea of L'shon Hara in the context of exposing abuse, and especially in Orthodox Jewish communities. And so I'm just going to read an excerpt from this because I think it was said really well. So, you shall not go up and down as a slanderer among your people, nor shall you stand by the blood of your friend. I am the Lord. Leviticus 19:16 is the basis of the biblical prohibitions prescribing L'shon Hara, talk that is damaging to another's reputation and is true. Motzi Shemra, talk that is damaging and is false. And Rekilut, tale-bearing. These prohibitions include not only speaking derogatorily, but listening to deprecating speech as well. while these prohibitions are serious and consequential, they are not absolute. There are times when one must share disparaging and critical information with others. There is a duty, for example, to testify in a court of law and to reveal information about another's illicit behavior. I think it was just really interesting to know that's where it comes from, that the idea of being a slanderer amongst your people is on the same level as standing idly by in the blood of your friend, and that even listening to gossip is as harmful as perpetuating an act of violence against someone in your community. Because as Abby talked about last week, like, what a great, very vivid example of why you should not do it. Like, that's very scary, just like in the Miriam story that Abby shared. And maybe you want to talk more about that in this context as well. But when you escalate the idea of talking about someone, telling something someone did, even if it's true, to the level of harming or murdering someone, then of course you're going to be terrified to talk about what's really going on in your community, right? So I think that was just really good contextual information for me for understanding why we've made talking about other people such a big deal, even when in practice we know that people talk about other people all the time.
And it is so interesting to hear those laid out as separate types of speech among people, because there is one that feels more aligned with what our vision of gossip is, which is the motzi shemra, which is talk that is damaging and is false. So I don't know, it's just very interesting to me that L'shon Hara is so specifically talk that is damaging to someone's reputation and is true, because a really large part of me is like, why would that be so bad? Okay, sure, if it's damaging to someone's reputation, that's bad, but if it's a truth that's being shared, to put that on the same level as bodily harm or even death to someone else feels intense and confusing. Yeah, I'm just curious what y'all's takes are on that.
I think it's intense and it's confusing, and I guess I'm thinking about the ways that it's used in Jewish spaces, what you're saying about cyberbullying, and I am curious if, like, some gossip is bad, and when kids do it can have really intense implications, and I'm just curious if it was, I don't know the history of it, but if it was like, oh, whoa, bad things are happening because people are talking about other kids behind their backs, and it is harmful, like physically harmful for kids, and we need to call it more than what it is. Or I don't know, like, we were calling it tail bearing, but now we need to up the antics a little bit, scare them in their tracks. That's not the way to deal with anything, but I am curious if, like, that's actually, sometimes it does cause harm, like real physical harm.
I think that's a really great point, and especially scaring children, because children will tell the truth often in a way that adults won't. And if we're thinking about also a community that might be very insular in the origin of when L'shon Hara starts being used, I don't even know when it's commonly used throughout Jewish history, but as a form of protection for your community against other communities or from the larger community that might be threatening the Jewish community. You can't have little Jewish kids running around talking about all the things that are going on in the Jewish community, because they might go tell something to somebody that they shouldn't, that puts an entire community in danger. And beyond just saying things that offend other children, it could seriously bring harm upon the community, that even if you're telling something true that has happened, it's this like, let's keep it in the family. Don't share our dirty laundry. Don't tell the world what we're doing, because they're going to come in here and they're going to do something worse to us, and it's going to be devastating to our community. So I think that escalates. Like, you start with children, don't say bad things about one another, because your responsibility to the community is greater than like anything else. And I think that's a very important value at certain times, but it's based on the survival mindset, and a lot of our practices really are based in survival still to this day. And I don't know what people think about if they should be or not, but I think that's a really good point.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense, like conceptualizing what might have been going on during the time when this guiding principles and the commandments were being written and the Torah was being written and really talked about in this way. I feel like it's so clearly led to just a really easy out for people to do really terrible things to other members of their community and then be like, okay, but you can't say anything about this though, because then that's L'shon Hara, because it's going to make me look really bad. And that's such a slippery slope to exist in now.
Yeah, and I think that's the whole thing that we were saying about gossip as in last time, about that whole thing about how gossip is about putting people down, and that society has made it so that conversations about what's happening are a way to address lots of different things like organizing and people coming out about sexual assault and all the things that like power. And it's hard because I think what you're saying, Jessie, it's confusing because it is nuanced, because it probably comes from real survival, and also it's something that we see all over society.
I don't want to skip over this great source that we have in here too, Alana, about the stereotype, because I feel like there is a double standard, of course, as we talked about in the Jewish community around gossip, that there is, I don't know. I find, at least with a lot of Jewish content, there's always, in media, there's always the threat of something really real that's really high up here, and then the kind of silly comedic storyline that's always going on underneath that reminds us that it is serious, but it's not that serious. And we talked a little bit about Fiddler on the Roof last time, but there's a very real threat of pogroms happening in the community. But there's also this comedic storyline of the threat to, you know, Tevye's control over the family, and isn't he the man of the household, doesn't he have control? And it's like silly because the real danger is something way bigger, but the like gossiping and the back and forth and the going behind his back and the antics and like all of that is what keeps it from being just a straight up tragedy. So, and I feel like a lot of that has to do with this bubby gossip stereotype that we see in media. So did you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I just like, whenever I think of gossip and Judaism, I feel like my brain has this very clear caricature almost of a Jewish bubby or a Jewish mother gossiping with their friends, even a Jewish grandfather. I don't know, my Jewish grandfather was such a gossip. How much of that is grounded in reality and why that's such a significant part of Judaism, and if it's just Judaism or if it's just sort of every culture that happens in. And if it is specifically Judaism, what are the harms of that stereotype or that caricature? And also, in what ways can we reframe that for a positive, I guess? Is that something that y'all also see or think about when you think of Jewish gossip?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of qualities that go along with the gossip that I don't know, nagging, annoying.
Well, I think the thing that
Ellie?
I've learned from normal gossip is that it's a widespread, I think, stereotype or just experience. Thank you, Normal Gossip Podcast. And I also think that, at least in the Jewish world, that is pertinent, especially to women. And I'm thinking about this idea of women in the balcony gossiping while Shabbat services are happening. And I think it maybe comes from isolation in certain spaces. And if we're thinking about the history of it, just oppressed people or people with less power are the people gossiping. I can only imagine that it is pertinent in lots of different communities, but the reason why I think we see it so much in the Jewish world is because it was a way to have power. And even in like the Mishnah, you hear about the gossiping women, and it's in a lot of different texts, and of course in the Torah, Miriam, the gossip. So I think all of that history leads to this bigger stereotype of gossipy, specifically women.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. I was actually at a cousin's bar mitzvah this past weekend, and his cousin is, I think, ultra Orthodox or something. And so the service is split by gender on either side of a divider. And I will say it was so clearly the men, I mean, obviously this is all very binary because there's no real acknowledgement of other genders, but that's besides the point. The men were so invested, all the prayers, all reading the Torah, da 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 da. And a lot of that is just because that's what's expected within that sect of Judaism. And it is the men who are able to read the Torah, and the Torah is only read on that side. But then I'm obviously sitting on the women's section, and honestly, most of us were just talking about other stuff the whole time. Half of us were just turning to each other, gossiping, honestly, like, oh, did you see da-da-da? Or, oh, like, what are they wearing? Or who's letting their kid run around like that? And I don't say I'm necessarily proud of the, outfit comments or commentary on how people are rearing their children, but that is super real. And it was just such a stark visual. Okay, we really all are sort of having these side conversations and not super paying attention to what's going on in the service. For the most part, there were some outliers. And yeah, I'm thinking of how that has sort of transcended throughout time and what that must have been like historically as well, when that divide was even stronger.
I think that's really interesting, thinking about the comments about other people's choices, whether it's with their children or their outfits, and how that transcends all different types of Judaism. I know high holiday services everywhere, Reform, Conservative, Orthodox, anywhere. People are remembering what someone did last year. I know in the high holiday services I went to, there was one family we always sat behind, and I don't know why we didn't move our seats. Every year we complained about the family that sat in front of us, and we still sat behind them every single year. And just all the different denominations or different groups engage in this behavior that it can be really harmful, and it can be bullying when taken to the extreme. But on a surface level, it's a way of marking time almost as well. Well, you remember when the other one was this age, they did this, or you remember when she was wearing this. It's a way of marking time when you don't have control and you don't have power, right? Is I am going to organize my time and tell time by these markers. That I think is really funny, the way you're making me remember my own experience of services, and specifically high holiday services with the women, even though it wasn't divided by gender.
That's super real. And I do think that's a good example of L'shon Hara. I think in it's the form that we're supposed to interpret. Okay, maybe what we're saying has some truth to it. Maybe someone is letting their kid run around, and that's not something that we think is cool, or maybe we wouldn't do, but that's not something for us to talk about or comment on, and can be damaging. Whereas that's very different than talking about the truth of sexual abuse or other forms of harm that are true and are damaging, but we do need to talk about.
Yeah, it's making me think, going back to Abby's comment about kids and what they say to one another being potentially really harmful, and there needing to be a check kind of through L'shon Hara about how serious this can be. It's making me think about what we've been talking about with power and who has power and how they claim power. And while we've been talking about gossip in terms of the oppressed or the workers reclaiming their power, children are oppressed in our society, and they're seeking out how they can get power and what the checks on power are. And so even though it's a completely different way of reclaiming power, children are trying to see what the consequences are within any community and how far they can push things. And I think what this article that we have here as well about the mishandling of sexual assault allegation at Camp Ramah is really, really important, because the problem there was that there was no real check on a child's behavior, and it was covered up. And the attempt to justify or rationalize a child's really harmful behavior because the adults did not want to confront what really happened is a perfect example of why we need to know who has power and what they're doing with that power, whether it's over children, whether it's over workers, women, however we want to say that we're checking power. These are the real consequences of putting people in power who cannot be trusted. And the reason why we have it in here is to prove that it's not just happening in Orthodox communities, because a lot of times Orthodox communities are getting all the heat for silencing survivors and persecuting survivors and pressuring survivors. But across the Jewish world, we silence people, and we do not take survivors seriously. So it's kind of 8 million different ideas relating to this one article, but had a lot of thoughts about it.
Well, I also want something that one of the allegations is that the director of the camp told the person who's named as Jane Doe that the rest of the kids are going to gossip about her, and that was actually used as a scare tactic, which is, I don't know, just like upsetting, but also like interesting way that gossip is used to like stoke fear, especially amongst kids at a time when social pressure is so intense, and especially at Jewish summer camp, when that is your community and those are the people who are watching out for you, that your community will start gossiping about you, and ultimately did. And that was, I don't know, just a threat as in and of itself.
That's super interesting. Knowing what kids would do and wagering that against a child's truth telling. Oh, it's just cruel. And to know that whether or not the words L'shon Hara were spoken, right, that is rooted in somebody's conception of Judaism, is that they knew that they would be justified in some way by saying this to a child, it's horrifying.
Yeah, and I feel like that line of thinking is used in situations like that constantly, like growing up in middle school or high school in time when technology was not new, but having smartphones was new, and the advent of social media was pretty new, and being able to send pictures to people was pretty new. And so sexting was all that school officials or whatever talked about. We had like full assemblies on just the harms of sexting and stuff, which, like, sure, you should be careful what you send to people, but I think a large part of the messaging was you don't want people to think X about you, or that's going to spread around, and so you shouldn't do it because of what people are going to think of you. Or if it is happening, even if it wasn't the explicit messaging, I think a lot of people felt scared to talk about it because of what other people's reaction to it would be, and what other people would be saying about them if things went wrong and then it was found out. So yeah, I do think that is really universal. I wanted to circle back to the Miriam story that we talked about last time, because I feel like we didn't spend a lot of time on it in our last episode, and I do think it's really interesting. And so I was wondering if Abby or Jessie, if you want to, could speak to that a little bit more as the last piece of today's episode.
Abby, Torah scholar, come on.
I can speak a little bit to it, but I would like to be corrected, which is that Miriam and Aaron are gossiping about, or talking about, Moses's wife in a pejorative way, and God hears them and punishes Miriam, who gets leprosy. And at the beginning, Moses just doesn't even understand what's happening. He's just confused why his sister has leprosy and is upset about it and asks God to heal her, but really just is in the dark about this whole thing. And so there are a couple parts of that which are weird. But the big thing is that both of them were gossiping, and it was bad gossip. It's an example of when gossip is not even a tool of power, but Miriam is punished in a pretty extreme way and put in isolation, whereas Aaron does not have that same experience.
Absolutely. I'm looking at the document and I'm reminded too that she specifically says it's because he married a Cushite woman, right? Which in Torah terms would be vaguely racist, right? Oh, she's from outside the community. So yeah, exactly what you're talking about, Abby. It's not good gossip in the sense that she's claiming power back from someone who is more powerful than her. But honestly, there are a lot of things that Moses does and gets away with that nobody questions. So sometimes I get it when people are critical, but agreed that that part is confusing to me too, because nothing seems to happen to Aaron. And like you said, that even hearing L'shon Hara should be considered as bad as speaking it, but only Miriam is the one that gets cursed with leprosy. And then it's only a short amount of time, right? That she has it, and then she's back to normal. So yeah, I mean, is that the procedure for L'shon Hara? Like a set amount of time? You know, you say this one bad thing, then you get this amount of time. It's a weird moment of God kind of, I don't know, I think of executing judgment on one sentence that someone spoke. Meanwhile, a lot of men do a lot of wild shit questioning Moses all the time, and nothing happens. I think Miriam is out of pocket for saying that, but I also am curious why that becomes the one instance of L'shon Hara.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. That's definitely not the only person who was critiquing Moses, and yet it is the main example given to talk about L'shon Hara. And so I do think in a lot of ways that's pretty intensely gendered. I also do think, though, that story, I was also thinking about the whole idea that it's based on Miriam talking about Moses's wife. And I hadn't really thought about it in that context before. And we could have really used this story to talk about how racism is not chill and is I don't think anything is a punishable offense, quote unquote, but is as bad as harming someone in some way. And yet we chose that as a moment to be like, gossip is bad. And I think a really good modern reframing of that story could be like, honestly, Miriam was being pretty racist because Cushite is basically synonymous with Ethiopian. That's like my understanding. So I don't know. Could be a good reframe on the L'shon Hara story.
That's a really great point, that we didn't have to take it so far as to say all gossip is bad.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think of something else. I do think that there are other examples of people questioning Moses and dying. And I was trying to wrap my head around just how these examples are different. But I wasn't able to figure it out. What is this saying? Is this, I don't know, is it because they're gossiping about Zipporah, that is, maybe it's not as bad. She's just getting leprosy rather than death. But I don't really know what the difference in punishment means in these instances.
No, I was thinking about it too, because the only thing it's not the same thing, because it's not gossip at all, as I was thinking about Aaron's sons, right? Mm-hmm. Don't they violate the mitzvot around preparing the fire or something, or they're fucking around with it, and they die immediately, instantly, and God's like, sorry, Aaron. That's another example, I feel, of just something really serious happens immediately, and it's no room for discussion, where at least Miriam gets that, like, 2-week period and can recover, and we can talk about whether it's fair or not. But you're right, other people do mess around with mitzvot, and Korach's the only one I can think of that, but that's like an open insurrection. There's got to be somewhere between the two anyway. But yeah, the scale of punishment or judgment does not seem to be equal or figured out yet, I feel like, in this part of the Torah.
I'm thinking about all the different examples. I get how people just spend their whole life interpreting the Torah, because like we could really go a lot of places with this. Any final thoughts re L'shon Hara re L'shon Hara or gossip in general and Judaism that we're missing?
I don't think we're missing anything. I think I just want to kind of tie some threads together, that there is merit to L'shon Hara, like all Jewish values, and there are times and places where it can be used. But I think in general, we should be critical of anyone who's overusing any Jewish value to justify what they're doing, whether it's Tikkun Olam, whether it's L'shon Hara. We just need to be really interrogating how Jewish values are employed, and if they're used as a blanket statement for someone's behavior.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Abby, what do you think as our resident gossip scholar?
No, I think that's a really good point. And I think that even more than like other values, some deep analysis of the ways that the Jewish community needs to think about how they like employ L'shon Hara in so many different aspects, both in education, but also in airing our dirty laundry idea, and the ways in which that idea and instilling that idea allows for institutions and people in power to get away with lots of different things. Yes, we've seen the Ramah example. The URJ also had a lot of stuff that came out about sexual assault over the past 50 years, and the ways in which they covered it up because of the protecting people in power, and how that is related to gossip, as we tell people not to talk about things.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thanks again for joining us, Abby, and making the series so wonderful. To anyone listening, stay tuned for our next series. TBD on when that's happening, but you can find out on our Instagram. It'll be at some point in the next month or so. Some things to mention. Shout out to Nate for our podcast music, as always. Shout out to Abby for joining us. Also, if you miss us while we're on a mini hiatus break between series, please feel free to reach out to us about any consultations for workshops or just general conversations on the work that we do. You can find more information on some of the work that we are willing to do with folks on our website. You can also sign up for our newsletter there or on the link in our bio of our Instagram, because our newsletter has all of our sources and it's also just really cute and you should all check it out. Thanks, y'all. Thanks, Jessie.
Thanks, Alana. This is great.
See y'all next time. Bye.
Bye.